Patrick Henningsen talks on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to TNT, today's News Talk. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. Thank you so much for joining us. Ukraine, the war drums are beating like crazy, and it's from the usual suspects. So we're going to call on some of the best experts to weigh in on this. So we're going to get to the bottom of this story before we're done. Rejoining us right now is a very special guest. We're very pleased to have somebody who is very familiar with the situation regarding Russia and Ukraine and the West's take on it. Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos is joining us right now. He's also author of the new book, Arise, Russia, The Return of Russia to World Politics. Hello, Marcus. How are you?
Hello, Patrick, and thank you ever so much for having me on your show.
I'm very, very pleased that you're on the show, Marcus, because I think you're one of the few people that might be able to cut through the absolute, what I think looks like a tsunami of disinformation and hysteria, like the likes of which we've not seen before, not with regards to geopolitics. I thought I'd seen everything, Marcus, but I guess I haven't after the last 3 or 4 weeks. What do you make of this situation, this talking up of a war with Russia and the West on using Ukraine as this sort of neutral playing field?
Well, none of what we are seeing in relation to Ukraine comes as any surprise to me. Indeed, for over 15 years now, I have been saying on television and on radio, and I have been writing in the form of my book and various articles and scholarly articles, that the day will come when there will be a very grave confrontation between America and Russia over Ukraine. What we are seeing at present in relation to Ukraine in the short term is a result of the West's coup in Ukraine in February of 2014, in which a democratically elected president, Viktor Yanukovych, was overthrown and replaced by a pro-Western, anti-Russian government. And in the long term, what we are seeing surrounding Ukraine is the West's coveting of the country, which has been ongoing for over 30 years now, ever since Ukraine became an independent country in December of 1991. There are economic reasons as to why the West, principally America, has been lusting after Ukraine for over 3 decades. The country has a very large industrial sector and a very large agricultural sector, coupled with a very skilled labor workforce. But more important than that is the fact of Ukraine's geostrategic importance. The Americans are acutely aware that in order to ensure that Russia never again becomes the force that it was in Soviet times, Ukraine must be in the West's orbit, and in particular, it must be a member of NATO, because a Ukraine in NATO will severely threaten Russian national security, would severely undermine Russia's strategic nuclear deterrent, and would complete the encirclement of Russia on its western borders with NATO member states from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. And a Russia weakened in Europe would be a Russia weakened in the world. But the Americans in the 1990s and in the 2000s underestimated the resolve of Russia, the resolve of the Russian leadership and the resolve of the Russian people to ensure that Russia would again become a superpower. And they underestimated the historic links between Russia and Ukraine. And they also underestimated the lengths that Russia will go to ensure that Ukraine never, ever joins the Western military bloc. Indeed, I have said for many years now that Russia will never countenance Ukrainian membership of NATO and will use all means at its disposal to ensure that that scenario does not materialize. And yes, that does also include Russian military action to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO.
And let me ask you this, Marcus. Even if the Western leaders, including Biden himself, they're saying Anthony Blinken, the failed rock star turned Secretary of State in the U.S., they're talking about saying that Ukraine's not going to join NATO. That it's a few years off. What is the difference, Marcus, if you're providing lethal arms and buckets of Javelin missiles and other things to a country, and you're saying you're going to back them militarily if Russia so-called allegedly invades eastern Ukraine? What's the difference between being a NATO member and then that situation? It's effectively a NATO member by fiat, isn't it?
Well, firstly, the Budapest Declaration of 2008 stipulated that Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia will one day become members of NATO. So when NATO's leaders today say that they have no plans for the foreseeable future for Ukraine to become a member of NATO, that is simply a lie. But also, as you quite rightly point out, the Americans and the British are starting to, or are already arming to the teeth, the Ukrainian armed forces. Why? To try and deter a possible Russian military campaign in Ukraine. Because the Americans, as a result of the coup in Ukraine in February of 2014, now have a very strong foothold in the country. Ukraine is in the West's sphere of influence. As each day, as each week, as each month, as each year passes, Ukraine integrates politically, economically, culturally, and militarily with the West. So once the Americans have a foothold in a country, it is very difficult to eject them from that country. However, for the time being, Ukraine cannot join the Western military bloc. Why? Because one of the requirements of NATO membership is for a country to be in complete control of its territory. Well, Kiev is not in control of the Crimea. Kiev is not in control of a third of the Donetsk Oblast, the Donetsk region, and also is not in control of a third of the Lugansk Oblast, the Lugansk region. And those regions will never come back under the control of Kiev. So for the time being, Ukraine cannot join the Western military bloc. But as I wrote in my book, the day could come when Kiev decides to redraw its borders, excluding the Crimea, excluding the third of Donetsk and the third of Lugansk. Then Ukraine would be free to join the Western military bloc. But as I said previously, Patrick, that day will not come. Russia will not countenance NATO's increasing presence in Ukraine. They will not countenance the American increasing presence along the Ukrainian coastline, in which the Americans are refurbishing the Ukrainian ports of Okhotsk and Odessa to accommodate American and British warships. So we have reached a culmination that was always going to happen once Russia became a superpower again, which it is today. And we are now facing a very distinct possibility that Russia will take some sort of action in Ukraine to ensure Russian national security.
And it's quite an amazing thing if you listen to the statements now. I mean, even Joe Biden in his press conference just last week, he was asked about this situation, and he says, we have an obligation under NATO Article 5, which says that if one NATO member is threatened, that all NATO members must come to the aid of that. But he changed the language, Marcus. He said that if a NATO ally is threatened, and so it was hard to see whether he meant Ukraine is an ally of NATO. It's certainly not a member of NATO, and so by the same token, Marcus, the U.S. is increasing its military positions in Poland. Okay, Poland is a NATO member, but that's not what Article 5 is about. It's not about bolstering your military presence within another NATO member's country, effectively threatening Russia on its border. But that's not what NATO 5 Article 5 is about. It's about if they're attacked. So are they trying to redefine the terms of the NATO treaty now?
Well, first of all, I personally don't attach any significance to any of the words which emanate from the mouth of Joe Biden. Secondly, Ukraine is an ally of the West. Ukraine essentially is a satellite state of the West, and Ukraine is an ally of the European Union and an ally of NATO. And as a result of that, should there be Russian military action in Ukraine, then of course the Americans and the British will supply military equipment to the Ukrainian armed forces, not to defend Ukraine per se, but to defend Ukraine's status as a satellite state of the West. That is why London and Washington is sending military equipment and sending military advisors, soldiers to Ukraine. It has nothing to do with democracy or freedom or the rule of law. This is about ensuring that the West's foothold in Ukraine is preserved so that one day Ukraine can join NATO. But no matter how much military equipment the Americans and the British send to the Ukrainian armed forces, that will not do anything to stall a Russian military campaign. Why? Because the vast amount of Ukrainian soldiers are drawn from the westernmost part of Ukraine, a part of the country which is very different to central Ukraine, very different to eastern Ukraine, and very different to southern Ukraine. Furthermore, almost all of the officers in the Ukrainian armed forces and all of the generals in the Ukrainian armed forces are also drawn from the westernmost part of Ukraine. So those are the soldiers who would put up resistance to a Russian campaign, military campaign in Ukraine. Again, the West is utterly ignorant about Ukraine. Western politicians and Western mainstream journalists have taken to the television and taken to the radio, have taken to newspapers to say that the Ukrainian people will resist, quote, Russian aggression. Well, there is no such thing as a Ukrainian people. There is no such thing as a Ukrainian national identity. Ukrainian nationalism in inverted commas, is overwhelmingly confined to the western part of Ukraine. So the regions of Volyn, Rivne, Lvov, Ivano-Frankivsk, and Ternopil, regions which prior to September of 1939 had never been part of Russia. They had first of all been part of Poland, then part of Austria or the Austrian Empire, then again part of Poland. That is where there is fierce anti-Russian sentiment, but that is it. So that is why I have made it very clear in television interviews that people in the east of Ukraine, people in the south of Ukraine, people in the center of Ukraine do not regard Russia as an alien country. Far from it. Millions of Ukrainians in the aforementioned areas regard themselves, identify themselves as part of the Russian world. That is not, quote, Russian propaganda. Anyone who is a specialist in Russian history, anyone who has been studying Russian history for a great many years will testify to that. People in Kharkov, people in Zaporizhia, people in Odessa, people in Mariupol, people in Kherson, people in Dnipro-Dzhinsk, people in Dmitro-Petrovsk regard themselves as part of the Russian world. And on top of that, the majority of the Ukrainian population are members of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. People in the westernmost regions of Ukraine are to a large extent Catholic. So again, that tells you where the anti-Russian sentiment is in Ukraine, in the westernmost regions. That is something that Western politicians and Western mainstream journalists are utterly ignorant about.
Yeah, it's really those old wounds, Marcus. They go right back to the Second World War, and we could even trace them further back. So here we are in 2021. Now we'll talk about. We're going to take a short break, Marcus, but I want to talk about what caused Ukraine to break up into the pieces that it has after 2014. And I think it's important that people understand that perspective, because this is a bit of context. It seems to be absolutely missing from all commentary on this issue right across the Western mainstream media. I'm looking forward to discussing that with you after the break. I'm Patrick Henningsen. We're here with Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos talking about Ukraine, Russia, and the West and war. We're going to take a short break here on TNT, today's News Talk.
You have the right to know. The right to know about culture. The right to know about the economy. The right to know about technology and to know about sports. You have the right to know about education and politics and the weather. You have the right to know what's happening abroad and in your backyard. But above all else, you have the right to know that this right is under attack, and we must work to protect it. Because in order to be free, we must be informed. Understand the threats. ProtectPressFreedom.org.
When you need to know what's going on around the world and at home, keep it on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
You're listening to today's News Talk TNT Radio Network. We're broadcasting out globally. We're here in the midweek. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. I've got a very special guest on the line, Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, author of Arise, Russia, The Return of Russia to World Politics. And before the break, we were getting into, I think we're getting close to the nub of the issue in terms of understanding how this situation has come to pass. And Marcus, for those who are listening who might not be as au fait with the region and the recent events, I'm talking about from 2014 onwards, if you can just succinctly, just quickly explain why the east of Ukraine has been more or less partitioned off, why there's a civil conflict between the West and the East, what noises were made after the coup, after the Maidan coup in 2014 that caused the East to be ostracized, as it were, and then also why Crimea decided to, I'm going to make a very controversial remark here, Marcus, decided to reunite with Russia rather than be annexed by Putin. Can you sort of demystify this in a nutshell for people?
Let me first of all say, Patrick, that in March of 1991, over 70% of the population of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic voted to preserve the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Secondly, it is a falsehood which has been put out by the West for a great many years now that Ukraine is politically and culturally divided along the Dnipro River between the East, which is pro-Russian, and the West, which is pro-Western. That is absolute nonsense. Ukraine is a highly regionalized country, which is largely a product of the Soviet period, in which the Soviet authorities encouraged people in, for example, the Ukrainian SSR to identify with their region and with the Soviet Union as a whole, as opposed to identifying with the Ukrainian SSR. So that is something which is very important for audiences in the West to understand. Now, turning to what's happened in 2014 in the country, following the coup in Kiev in February of that year, which brought to power vehemently anti-Russian people, again, almost exclusively drawn from the westernmost part of the country, people in other regions of Ukraine, such as the Donbass, which comprises Lugansk and Donetsk, and also in the Crimea, were petrified. They were petrified because the people who came to power were celebrating or identified with a very sinister period in European history, in which Ukrainians, again, from the western part of the country, collaborated with the Nazi occupiers of Ukraine during the Second World War. So the people who came to power through a Western coup in February of 2014 regard the organization of Ukrainian nationalists, which was present during the Nazi occupation of Ukraine, and its military wing, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, and its overall leader, Stepan Bandera, as heroes. And the OUN and the UPA and their leader, Bandera, were responsible for heinous crimes committed against Soviet civilians in Ukraine and Red Army prisoners of war. And the people, again, who came to power in the coup, through the coup in February of 2014, were clearly threatening the parts of Ukraine which identify with the Russian world. So that is why people in Crimea rallied to break away from Ukraine. And they actually had every legal right to do. Why? Because the coup destroyed the Ukrainian constitution, because a democratically elected leader had been overthrown. He had been overthrown because he had taken a decision for Ukraine to integrate with the Eurasian Union instead of integrating with the European Union. But because a democratically elected leader had been overthrown, that meant that the Ukrainian constitution was null, was void. Therefore, the people of the Crimea had every right to rally, to break away, and to reunify with Russia. And the people in Donetsk and Lugansk, in the eastern part of Ukraine, also took the same steps. Now, of course, they have established their own independent republics, the Donetsk People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic. But they still saw the threat emanating from the new government in Kiev. So that is why they broke away. And that is why never again will they be ruled by the government in Kiev. And let me give you an example of the violent credentials of the government in Kiev. Midway through 2014, so just a few months after the coup, in the trade union house in Odessa, which is historically, it's a Russian port. Most of the people there identify themselves as part of the Russian world. In the trade union house, protesters against the coup had gathered there, and Ukrainian militias from the western part of the country gathered outside of that trade union building, set it on fire, resulting in near enough every single person in the building burning to death, suffering agonizing deaths. There was no remorse shown by the Ukrainian government. There was no regret shown. There was no investigation launched. And as a result, no arrests were made. No one was prosecuted. I can also say this, Patrick, that in the last 8 years, Ukrainian nationalist militias, again, from the western part of the country, such as Lvov and Ternopil, are marauding in central Ukraine, eastern Ukraine, and southern Ukraine, intimidating the people there, because they know very well that in those parts of the country which form the majority of Ukraine, they are opposed to Ukrainian nationalism. They are opposed to integration with the West. They identify themselves as parts of the Russian world.
And so that's a great synopsis. Thank you for that, Marcus. And so we hear that the cries in Western media, Western politicians, they've all said, because of some unnamed intelligence source initially in the U.S., that they have intelligence that Russia is going to invade the Ukraine. They're amassing 100,000 plus troops on the border, and they're going to invade in late January or early February. They'll probably revise that by next week. But it seems like there's a psychological operation going on here, Marcus, whereby Russia has announced, many times in the past that if civilians or vulnerable people in the East are under threat or serious threat of serious civilian casualties as a result of the Ukrainian military moving forward on that region, that they would be forced to or compelled on a humanitarian level to intervene. And so are the West trying to jump out in front and maybe could a false flag, for instance, I'm telling you how risky this situation is, some kind of confusion or a cross of signals or a false flag event or an MH17 event could cause a situation where Russia would be compelled to invade, and then the West would say, we told you they're going to invade, now they're going to pay the price. There's some serious brinksmanship and games going on here, Marcus. What do you make of this?
Well, it's an exceedingly dangerous state of affairs. I think, first of all, the West has instigated this crisis, a crisis which has been in the making for over a year now because of the deployment of NATO forces to the Baltic states and to Eastern Europe and to the Black Sea region, which is a gross violation of the NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997, which stipulates that NATO forces will not be stationed in Eastern Europe. Secondly, NATO needs an enemy in order to justify its continued existence and to justify its deployments along the Russian border. Thirdly, the military-industrial complex in the West, specifically in America, also needs an enemy to attract a constant increase in the defense budget. Also, the West is attempting to cling on to its foothold in Ukraine, something they will not give up easily. But as you correctly pointed out, Patrick, they are looking to provoke Russia into taking some sort of military action. And whilst the chances of a war between America and Russia over Ukraine breaking out is remote, the chances of an accidental war breaking out between the two superpowers over Ukraine is very distinct, is very possible, because the Americans are increasing their presence and NATO's overall presence along the western border of the Russian Federation. They are increasing their naval presence in the Baltic Sea. They are increasing their naval presence in the Black Sea. What else can Russia do to alleviate this danger emanating from Ukraine? So it is a possibility. And again, I've been saying this for many years. Russia would resort to military means to defend itself on its southern border. And I wrote in my book that I regard Ukraine as constituting Russia's soft underbelly. So no one should be surprised if Russia does take some sort of military action to eliminate the growing menace to its national security in Ukraine and also in the Black Sea region. But again, the dangers of the game that the West is playing is all clear to see. But we must clarify something, Patrick. NATO is not united on this issue. The French, the Germans, the Hungarians, the Italians, the Spanish, the Greeks, the Bulgarians are opposed to the American and British-led NATO aggressive moves towards Russia. Which countries in NATO are supporting the Americans and the British, who are the de facto leaders of the Western military bloc? Well, naturally, Poland, for example, and the Baltic states. They have a reason for the Americans and the British to use NATO to threaten Russia, because they bitterly dislike Russia. But NATO is not united. All is not well within the Western military bloc.
And the last thing, we just got a couple of minutes left, 2 minutes left, Marcus. I want to get your opinion. I'm in the mind, Marcus, that the other big target of all of this kerfuffle is Germany. When I say that, I mean the object is to pull Germany away from the east, away from Russia. That you've got the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which Germany and Russia did as a joint venture. The U.S. is very keen, and Britain is very keen to interrupt that, to cancel it, to stop it, not just because of the energy supplies, but also just the influence they believe that Russia will have with a good trading relationship, let's say, with a country like Germany, and would open the door to Germany to the east. How important do you think Germany is in the position and the future of Germany in this scenario? Just a couple minutes left, Marcus.
Yes, I agree with your view entirely, Patrick. Washington and London are very concerned about how close politically and economically Germany and the Russian Federation are. There is Nord Stream 2, but Germany, under pressure from America, has suspended that project. Now, Nord Stream 2 would have ensured a constant, uninterrupted flow of Russian natural gas to Germany, which would have been imperative for German industry and imperative for German domestic households. In short, it would have been good for Germany. But under pressure from the Americans, remember, Germany is a strategic ally to America, Berlin suspended the project. But the Germans, whilst they are strategic allies to the Americans, are not a colony of America's. They're not a satellite state of America's. So the Americans and the British, they are trying to exert as much pressure on Germany, including in private quarters, threatening the Germans to begin the process of distancing themselves from Russia. But that is unlikely to happen because Germany has very, very embedded memories of the war on the Eastern Front during World War II. So Germany does not wish to see any military action in its name carried out against Russia. But also the German and Russian economic relationship is greatly beneficial to both countries. And yes, that, as I say, to both countries, including Germany. So the Germans are going to resist the pressure being piled upon them to distance themselves from Russia by the Americans and also by the British.
Yes, thank you for that opinion as well. I think that's an important point. But anyway, this is just a developing story, and we really appreciate your analysis on this, Marcus. Let me remind people, Marcus Papadopoulos is the author of Rise Russia, The Return of Russia to World Politics. That's available on most reputable booksellers' websites, and also, Marcus, at your blog site as well, I believe, yes?
Indeed it is.
Thank you very much for joining us this week, Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Patrick. Thank you for having me on.